My goodness, it's such a pleasure to see you all here. And it's just incredible that we have the Restoration Management Project Review Forum today for the RESTORE Act. This meeting came together in just record time. It's a national meeting, basically, that we threw together in 3 weeks. I'd like to thank the Conservancy of Southwest Florida for bringing us kids together to do something really good. And I'd also like to thank the Environmental Law Institute and the National Wildlife Federation for sponsoring this workshop and forum. I'd also like to thank Charlotte County for providing us this beautiful facility. I'm really excited to be able to talk about the RESTORE Act, at least in concept, because there are no decisions made yet, but we want to be in the ground floor of helping to make those decisions and make recommendations. I'd like to also remind everyone that we need you to sign in, and it may be valuable to you in case you need that alibi later on. So make sure you register. I'd like to go ahead and introduce Teresa Chan with the Environmental Law Institute to talk about the overview of the Restoration Recovery Program. Teresa?
Good morning, everyone. As Dr. Beaver said, I am Teresa Chan from the Environmental Law Institute. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Environmental Law Institute, we are a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. And we don't litigate, don't really advocate, but we really focus in on research and education. And we have been involved with the issues surrounding the Gulf spill in the last 2 years or so. And we've been coming here and doing education and research and also workshops throughout the Gulf. So we're pleased to be here today. So as indicated, I'm going to give an overview of the restoration and recovery processes that are going on in the Gulf right now. And I'm really going to focus in on 4 different processes. The first one is the Clean Water Act, and which is also sort of lumped in with RESTORE because that's how the RESTORE Act will be funded. The second is the Natural Resource Damage Assessment process. The third, the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Task Force. And fourth, the Economic Damages Claims. Now, just a quick programming note. I'm going to speak and give an overview of these 4 processes. But we're also going to have my colleague Jordan Diamond and then David White from NWF speak about RESTORE in much more detail. So if you have any sort of clarifying questions, please feel free to ask me throughout my presentation. But if you have any substantive questions, it might make sense to wait until their presentations are over so that you can ask those questions. Okay, well, off the bat, you might be wondering why I'm here talking about 4 different processes when we're really here to focus in on RESTORE. And I think there's a lot of good reasons to talk about the other processes, but I think there's 2 ones in particular. The first is that there seems to be a lot of confusion amongst these different processes. So people seem to not always be clear about who's involved with each, where the money's coming from, and what their purpose is. So I think it's important to compare and contrast amongst these just so we know when we're talking about different processes what's involved. Second, and I think this is important for today's discussion, is that RESTORE is not going to be implemented in a vacuum. There's likely to be quite a bit of overlap between RESTORE and these other different things that are going on in the Gulf right now. So it's a good idea to be familiar with all the different processes. Now, the first one I'm going to start off with is the Clean Water Act fines and penalties. So I'm going to just take a step back for a second, and I'm sure most of you are aware, but the Clean Water Act is a federal statute which regulates the discharge of pollutants into U.S. waters. So if parties like BP or Anadarko violate the Clean Water Act by discharging oil into the U.S. waters, they are subject to fines and penalties under the Clean Water Act. Now, the purpose of these fines is to punish those violators, punish and then deter future violators. And the U.S. government has already filed a lawsuit in order to recover these Clean Water Act fines from BP and other responsible parties. So let's talk money for a second. I think probably many of you have heard a range of values when we're talking about the Clean Water Act fines and penalties. And this chart gives I think some of the variables that are at issue and why we're hearing a range of values when we're talking about fines under the Clean Water Act. Now, the first variable is the Clean Water Act gives discretion to determine the fines either on a per day basis or a per barrel basis. So you can see that there's actually a huge range here. If you're calculating on a per day basis, it's $37,500 per day, which really gives you a Clean Water Act fine somewhere in the low millions of dollars. Whereas when you're calculating it on a per barrel basis, that fine jumps significantly. It's $1,100 per barrel. You times it by the 4.1 million barrels of oil that was spilled into the Gulf, you've got in the billions of dollars. Now, a second variable that is at play here is the actions of the responsible parties. So did BP and others act with due diligence or with gross negligence and willful misconduct? If it's found to be the second, then those fines jump exponentially. In fact, as you can see, the fines jump almost 4 times, both on a per barrel and a per day basis. So you've got a huge range in terms of the dollar amounts at issue here. And 2 other variables that I haven't really put into this chart here, but that are going to be at play. First is the amount of oil that was spilled into the Gulf. I'm using 4.1 million barrels here, and that's the amount that the federal government is saying spilt into the Gulf. But that is a number that is in dispute. So you probably will see that number sort of switching up, and if this does go to trial, that might not be the ultimate number that is found. A second, and I think very important variable, is settlement. I think probably we've heard a lot about rumblings about settlement, that potentially these Clean Water Act fines and other fines might be settled. And if there is a settlement, this number could change up as well. So speaking about where this money usually goes, we're talking about restore and diverting Clean Water Act fines into the Gulf for ecosystem and economic restoration. But usually these fines go to what's called the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund, which is a fund that was set up by Congress in order to hold certain fines and penalties and payments and taxes made by oil and gas companies. And that money in turn is used for a number of different purposes. For example, responding to oil spills and also paying for restoration costs where they can't find a responsible party or where the responsible party is a government entity. So that's where the fines usually go. But I think fairly early on in this case, you heard people saying that a portion of these fines should go to Gulf Coast restoration in some way. So that's where the RESTORE Act comes in. Now, as I mentioned, David and Jordan are going to go over the RESTORE Act in quite a bit of detail, so I'm just going to go over this very briefly, but to say that what the RESTORE Act does is diverts 80% of the Clean Water Act fines away from the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund into these 5 different pots here. So 20% is actually still going to go to the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. And the other 80% are going to be split up into these 5 different pots, which Jordan's going to go through one by one. But I did just want to note that for the most part, this money is going to go into economic and ecological restoration. And if you look here at one of these pots, this 30% plus 50% of the interest, that is going to a interstate council, which I'm going to call the RESTORE Council throughout the rest of this presentation. And they're to use that money to come up with a comprehensive plan for ecosystem restoration. So those are the only couple points I want to make on RESTORE. I think those are important for the rest of this discussion, but otherwise Jordan's going to get into the rest of that. Okay, so that's the first process. The second process I want to talk about is the natural resource damage assessment. So the natural resource damage assessment is a legal process in which governments try and determine what damage was caused by an oil spill and then how to fix that damage. So the goal of a NRDA is to make the public whole. Well, how does that happen? It happens in 2 main ways. The first way is to restore the natural resources to the condition they would have been if the oil spill had never occurred. So restoring natural resources. The second is compensating for interim losses. Well, what does that mean? Well, when a natural resource is damaged by an oil spill, there's a particular amount of time it takes for that natural resource to recover. It could take months, it could take years. Well, the public has to be compensated in some way for not being able to use that resource for those months or years. So that's another part of the restoration piece and something that the responsible party has to pay for. And I think this is probably a point that's worth emphasizing, which is unlike the Clean Water Act fines, which are meant to punish and to deter, these a NRDA is meant to only be compensatory, meaning responsible parties only have to pay for what they broke. They don't have to pay for anything else than that. So there has to be some sort of nexus to the injury in order for them to have to pay for that. Just briefly before getting to this, I did also want to note that there are three main parties who are usually involved in a natural resource damage assessment. There's first of all the trustees, and I think as I mentioned, governments are the ones who are involved in this. And the trustees are those federal, state, and tribal representatives that have responsibility for the natural resources that have been damaged. In this case, we only have federal and state representatives, and they formed a trustee council. And they're the ones who run the show. And they're in charge of this whole assessment process. The second party is, and I've mentioned them a couple of times now, is the responsible party. In other words, those parties who are responsible for the spill. They're the ones who have to pay for all the damages that were caused, and they also have to pay for the assessment. Now, under the law, the trustees are encouraged to invite these responsible parties to participate in the assessment. So in this case, you had that as well. You had the trustees reaching out to BP and other responsible parties and saying, you can come to the table and participate in this assessment. And the only party that has taken them up on that offer is BP. So BP is actually at the table and is participating in this NRDA. So the final group I want to talk about in terms of who is involved in a NRDA is the public. Now, the public doesn't usually play a huge role in a NRDA because it's a fairly legal process. It's not that transparent. But that said, there are certain times in the process where the trustees have to reach out, are required by law, to reach out to the public and ask them for their input. In addition, I think that this case is unprecedented in so many different ways. It's so large, given the number of states that are involved, that you see the trustees actually reaching out in a way that they haven't before and trying to be more transparent than they have in other NRDAs. I mean, certainly some people would say that it's still not enough, but they would say that this is more than they ever do. And one other note on the public participation side, which is that, the public often, even though they're sort of excluded from the process a lot of times, they often will insert themselves into the process anyway, even if they're not specifically invited to do so. You've seen this in other cases. You're seeing it in this particular case as well. You see a lot of NGOs, you see a lot of individuals trying to insert themselves and try and figuring out what's going on and trying to keep trying to talk to the trustees and understand where they're going to go next. So I'm going to turn then to just for a second here to talk about where we are now in the NRDA. As you can see here, there are three different stages of the NRDA process. So there's pre-assessment, injury assessment, and restoration planning, as well as restoration implementation. We are sitting in that second phase right now. They are still trying to determine what the injuries were that were caused by the spill and are trying to plan the different restoration projects that they're going to implement in order to restore those natural resources. I think it may be a little confusing to some people because you've probably heard that there's actually some restoration that has already started. And so it might be a little confusing. We're sitting in the second stage and they're still doing the injury assessment. How is it that we're starting to do some restoration implementation already? Well, it's because of this agreement that was reached between BP and the trustees, and it's called an early restoration agreement. And that agreement allows the trustees to engage in some restoration projects before the assessment is complete. And that is actually a big sum of money. They've given $1 billion over to the trustees in order to start these restoration projects. And this chart here basically gives an overview of how that $1 billion has been split up. You can see that half was given to the state trustees in equal shares, and half was given over to the federal trustees. But even the pot that was given to the federal trustees, there is a portion of that, $300 million of that is supposed to be spent on state projects. there's actually quite a bit of money that is available right now in order to spend on state-specific projects. And you'll notice that Florida was also given $100 million. And at this point in time, things are moving fairly slowly on the early restoration front. In Florida, we only have 2 projects that have been approved. There's one to deal with boat ramps, building boat ramps, and the second one with dune restoration. And those 2 projects altogether are only $5 million, so 5% of the funds that have been allocated specifically to Florida. So you still have a ton of restoration dollars that are at stake here, and also lots of opportunities sort of to participate and give your ideas about what sort of restoration projects should go forward. So I'm going to talk for a second about what NRDA has to do with Restore. On the face of it, it really doesn't have much to do with it. The Restore Act says that nothing in the Act will affect the ongoing assessment process. But that said, as a practical matter, there's likely to be some overlap between NRDA and Restore. As I mentioned, NRDA is dealing with, focusing on restoring natural resources that were damaged by the oil spill. Now, Restore has the opportunity to also focus in on ecosystem restoration. And while it's not constrained in the same way as a NRDA, the NRDA is constrained because it can only deal with damages caused by the oil spill, there's still an opportunity for some overlap there. So there certainly needs to be some coordination between the 2 processes in order to ensure that Restore Act dollars are not being used for projects that could be covered by a NRDA. I want to focus in on maximizing restoration dollars. So coordination is certainly needed. And I think you're seeing some recognition that coordination is needed, because recently the president appointed the USDA and EPA to the Trustee Council, which basically starts to align the members of the Trustee Council with the members of this new Restore Council. So I think this is certainly signaling an intent that there should be some coordination between the 2 processes. But I also think that it's important that this is kept in mind as we move forward in terms of reviewing and also in proposing restoration projects, because we have to ensure that there's not too much overlap between them. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Task Force. Now, this was an advisory body that the president established by executive order back in October of 2010, and is made up of a mix of state and federal representatives, and is chaired by EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson. And the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Task Force was given a very broad mandate, which was to coordinate long-term conservation and restoration efforts in the Gulf. And they were also tasked with coming up with a restoration strategy for the Gulf, and they were given 1 year to do that. So a pretty tall order, coming up with a restoration strategy in 1 year. So in that year, starting in October of 2010 all the way through October of 2011, the task force held a series of public meetings throughout the Gulf in order to get input from a bunch of different stakeholders. And in October of 2011, they issued their draft restoration plan. And then December of that same year, they issued their final plan. I'd say that plan is still a fairly high-level document, but what it does is it sets out 4 main restoration goals, and then sets out a list of actions that should be taken in order to accomplish those goals. Now, of course, since the task force released its strategy, we've had the Restore Act passed, and we've had the establishment of the Restore Council. And that Restore Council basically has the duty of this task force, coming up with a comprehensive restoration plan for the Gulf. So it's not surprising that rather recently the president issued another executive order in which it terminates this task force within 60 days after the Restore Council starts its work. So you might wonder to yourself, why are we talking about this task force if it's set to terminate fairly soon? Well, the reason is that this task force and its strategy will likely still play an important role in Gulf restoration. It's because the Restore Act carves out a role for both of them. The Restore Act says, in particular, that the new Restore Council is supposed to coordinate when it's coming up with its plan with the task force. And I think more importantly, what it says is that it's the new council is supposed to incorporate the final strategy into its own comprehensive plan. So even though you're going to see the task force going away and terminating rather soon, I think it's still going to play an important role in Gulf restoration going forward. Okay, so the final bucket here, the final process I'm going to talk about today, which is economic damages claims. Now, these are the claims filed by individuals, businesses, and governments in order to recover economic damages that were caused by the BP oil spill. And depending on the type of claim, there's different processes that are at stake here. You know, there's, I think probably many of you have heard about the Gulf Coast Claims Facility, which was run by Ken Feinberg. And that was set up in August of 2010 in order to deal with and claims that were filed by individuals and businesses and hopefully settled out of court. But in addition to that claims facility, many different individuals and businesses filed claims in court. And many of these were consolidated in what's called the multi-district litigation. Now, the multi-district litigation is basically a consolidation of a bunch of different cases. These are not just economic claims, but different types of claims from governments, from individuals and businesses. And it also includes the Clean Water Act fines that have been filed by the government. And the reason that they're all consolidated into one case is because, or into one trial basically, is done for efficiency's sake. It was determined that there's going to be a lot of different issues that are going to come up in each and every one of these cases. So they might as well try them all together and determine all those things at one time so that it would be more efficient that way. But anyway, just going back for a second here. So you've got the Gulf Coast Claims Facility, but you also have these claims that are in court. Very recently, there was a settlement reached in the court case, which basically resolved many of the economic and medical claims that were at issue. And when that settlement was reached, the Gulf Coast Claims Facility was shut down, and a new court-supervised process was put in its place. And just a note on the settlements, they're actually not finalized yet. They've been granted some preliminary approval, but the final determination isn't going to be made until November 8th. So you'll see a lot of the economic claims as well as medical claims resolved by this litigation. But I should note that even if the settlements are given final approval, it isn't necessarily going to resolve all of the economic and medical claims that are out there. There are certain claims that are not covered by the settlement. And also, just as importantly, individuals and businesses were given the option of opting out of these settlements. So they're free to continue on with other ways of trying to seek damages against BP and other responsible parties. So I think we're certainly going to see additional claims on this front in the near future. So the final thing I want to talk about is how economic claims and restore are potentially related. I will say that this is one process that there's actually not a bunch of overlap between it and restore. I think I mentioned that this multi-district litigation is dealing with Clean Water Act fines, but I think that's a pretty tenuous link. Mostly these two processes are operating separately and in different parallel paths. So there isn't a whole lot of overlap, but I think it's certainly important to understand that this is another thing that is going on in the Gulf right now for restoration. So that is a pretty quick overview of the four main restoration and recovery processes that are going on right now in the Gulf. As I mentioned earlier, I'm happy to take some questions right now to clarify a few points, but Jordan and David are going to be going into quite a bit of detail about restore. So if you do have any substantive questions, you may want to hold those.
I have a couple, so you're going to have to forgive. Oh, I'm sorry. Jennifer Hecker with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida. Could you go into more about, you had said that the NRDA process overlaps with the RESTORE Act and that there needs to be coordination. Mm-hmm. And I thought I heard you say the coordination to make sure that the money from one is not used necessarily for the other. And can you go into a little bit further about where the overlap is between the two and how that coordination is occurring or not occurring, how it could be improved?
Right. So I guess my point is in regards to is that there's similar projects that could be undertaken under NRDA, which are similar to projects that could be undertaken under Restore. If you look at the list of projects that are available in certain pots of money and what that money can be used for, that could overlap potentially. I'm not saying it would for sure, but there is a potential for overlap there in the same sorts of projects. Because I think, for example, one of the categories, and I know Jordan and David will probably go into this in more detail, but one of the categories is for projects is looking at the long-term resiliency of resources that are affected by the oil spill. So there's as I said, since Restore hasn't started and you know, we haven't seen all the projects that are coming into play in the NRDA process, it's sort of right now hypothetical, but it's a possibility. And as I said, I think that right now they're realizing that there needs to be coordination because, and this is, I'm sort of reading into it a little bit, but what we've seen is the alignment of the trustee council with the Restore council. So I would suspect that what they're trying to do is align them so that there's a bit of closer coordination between those two processes.
Good morning. My name is Mick Denham. I'm from the city of Sanibel. I'm a vice mayor of the city of Sanibel. Obviously, we were a long way from the actual spill, and there wasn't a lot of evidence in the area of oil reaching our beaches. Now, there was a perceived problem, and the perceived problem affected the tourism trade, so it was certainly an economic disadvantage issue for us. But in terms of restoring our environment, we didn't have any evidence of oil on the beaches. But on the other hand, you know, we're all aware that there is a possible impact on fisheries out in the Gulf, and that has an impact, an indirect impact from us locally, from fishing, the fishing industry, and also sport fishing. So I'm a little confused as to about whether we really have a leg to stand on relative to try and improving our environment or restoring our environment because of the oil spill. So I'm here primarily to see whether there is something which we can do from our local area relative to restoration. Thank you.
Right. Well, certainly, as I mentioned in regards to NRDA, there does have to be a nexus. So they do have to find that some sort of ecosystem damage was related to the oil spill itself and wasn't related to some sort of something that was already happening, you know, that this is, you know, I think that's something that you're hearing BP talk a little bit about now, which is that there's a bit of an argument about what the baseline conditions were. In other words, what the conditions were before the spill and what was caused by the spill and what was already happening in the Gulf of Mexico. And I think that is an incredibly complicated science piece, which I think people are trying to, and I'm not exactly sure where it stands in terms of what the trustees are finding right now. In terms of links to certain damages. But you're right to say that NRDA only covers damages by the oil spill, so there has to be some sort of link. Now, Restore is not constrained in that same way. I mean, we're going to hear soon from Jordan and from David about that, but it's not constrained to just oil spill damages and can focus in on ecosystem damages that have occurred over time. So it's not constrained in the same way as a NRDA is.
I just had one other question. I was hoping you could go a little bit further into, you had talked about the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Task Force and then the fact that it's going to terminate with the Restoration Council, but it will still remain somewhat active in making sure that its recommendations or ideas are somewhat implemented and folded into the next iteration of this with the Restoration Council. Could you go into a little bit more about how that's going to work or how you see that playing out?
Right. The act is, I think, pretty clear that they're supposed to, incorporate the task force strategy into their own comprehensive plan. I'm not sure. I think at this stage it's very clear as to how that's going to play out. I think certainly a lot of people in the, particularly environmental community, are going to be, focusing in on that and trying to figure out if they are in fact doing that. But there are some very quick timelines that are coming up for this Restore Council. And they have, I don't want to go into too much detail as to that, just because I know that others will be talking about it. But they have 6 months to come up with the draft plan, so at the beginning of January. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out and what they're going to be relying upon over the next few months in order to come up with that draft plan.
There was a newspaper, Pete Quashis. There was a newspaper article yesterday indicating that there are negotiations going on to try and divert funds not to the RESTORE Act, but to federal agencies by having the assessments and the fines under the Natural Resources Act rather than the Clean Water Act. Would you address that, please?
Sorry, what was the last? Did you just say ask to comment on that, or is that?
All I saw was the newspaper article
Right.
yesterday,
Yeah.
and there was some indication that that there were negotiations underway to try and prevent funds from going to the RESTORE Act and have them allocated to federal agencies for for reallocation on a greater basis.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen that over time. I mean, it's unclear, I think, for those of us standing on the outside to understand necessarily what's going on in those settlement discussions. But there's certainly some leeway for the government and BP and others to sort of determine how those, how fines and how damages and whatnot are going to be allocated between the different pots. I've heard also as well that they might be shifting some more to the natural resource damage assessment and away from the fines. I'm not sure if that's actually true or not, because we've heard different things over even the last couple of years. So I think it's not really clear which way they're going to go at this point, and I have no insider knowledge onto that, unfortunately.
I think I read an account that the NRDA, Ralph Brooks, attorney, I think in the newspaper accounts that I read yesterday, and I'm not sure if this is true or not, you may know, is ELI, NRDA damages would be tax deductible, where Clean Water Act fines and penalties would not be tax deductible for BP. Is that correct statement under the law?
I'm actually, I mean, I do know that fines and penalties are not tax deductible. I think, and we were talking about this yesterday, David, I think you had mentioned that perhaps the NRDA damages are in fact tax deductible. I knew fines and penalties as a general matter are not tax deductible, so. Absolutely. I think it might play a role.
Hi, Melanie Higgins, Quest Ecology, and you have to forgive me because I'm not a scientist, but this directly relates to the Vice Mayor's concerns. I recently saw a presentation by a volcanologist at USF, and I can't remember her name. She's a PhD scientist, and she's studying the plume that resulted from the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon and where that plume is going and the oil that resulted from it. And one of the things that they're taking into consideration is the application of Corexit on the surface, and that really interfered with the amount of oil that appeared to have been a result of the explosion. Do you know anything about this study? Are you coordinating with, or is any, because she said that it was going to take 2 years to develop the model and really see results from it. But they're looking into oil that's currently on the bottom of the Gulf and that has created bathtub rings and is under the beaches, as well as effects on fish. And with you talking about how long the process is going to take to develop these restoration projects, I think the results of the model would probably show a lot and have an effect on that. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm actually not aware of, I'm also not a scientist, so I haven't been really following all the various studies that have been going on in regards to the dispersants. So I can't really comment on that. But only to say that the results of response actions are also folded up into the NRDA and are taken into account. And the responsible parties are also responsible for paying for damages that happened because of the response actions. But in regards to the particular studies, I have no knowledge of those.
Kelly Dixon with Moat Marine Laboratory. You had, it seems like there's going to be a timeline with the allocation between the RESTORE and the NRDA funding. And then it seems like there's going to be another kind of protracted battle on the assessment on whether it's per day or per barrel or the diligence or or willful, whatever. Do you want to take a stab at what those timelines might actually end up being?
Oh gosh, I'm not sure I want to, because I know that anything I say will probably be wrong in that regard, because I think it's unclear, as I said, just trying to determine what's going to happen. I mean, settlement could be imminent. It could take months or years. I mean, it's hard to say. People have been reading into any sort of actions that have happened, and I think that it's really hard unless you're even maybe if you're even sitting in this across the table from each other, you're still not sure how long it's going to take to play out. So I'm probably not going to venture into that territory.
Lisa Beaver, Charlotte Harbor National Estuary Program. On your chart, you showed 4.1 million barrels. Has that been determined? Has that been set? Or is that still a point of negotiation?
It's still a point of dispute. That's the number we've been using because that's what the federal government has been using. So they estimate that 4.9 million barrels were released, but they captured 0.8 million barrels of that. So that's why they came up with the 4.1 million barrels of oil. But that is certainly in dispute still.
Ralph Brooks again. Are you aware of any criminal prosecutions that are going on with regard to the BP spill at federal or state levels, and how would that interact with this in terms of any penalty money coming from criminal restitution?
I'm aware of one criminal case that has been charged that so far against I believe it was one of the engineers of BP for deleting some of the texts that went between him and other BP representatives around the spill. So there's one criminal charge pending right now. Kurt Mix, I think, is his name. Yeah, I mean, there's still certainly that option for the government to file more criminal penalty cases. So I think certainly we'll be looking out for those.
Questions? I think this has been really good. It's nice that we've had the extra time to have a nice discussion about the general outline that you've provided. Thank you so much, Teresa.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.